All right, so where are the Arizona Cardinals heading into free agency 2022? And more importantly, where should the Cardinals be? That is the big question here in the offseason for the Big Red. And that's why we're here for the Free Agent Primer 2022. Paul Calvisi, Craig Grialou, Darren Urban, Dani Sureck. Gree, how many unrestricted free agents are pending?
21.
Darren, where do you start?
I would think, Paul, I mean, for me, the big name is Chandler Jones, of course. You're talking about a player who had 10.5 sacks this year. He's been a Pro Bowler. He's been an All-Pro. And if he's gone, you have a big hole in the pass rush. I mean, I think Marcus Golden had a great year. I think you've seen some flashes out of Dennis Gardeck at least 2 years ago. But without Chandler Jones, you've got a pretty big vacancy if you don't bring him back. And right now, the way this is kind of playing out and how it feels a little Patrick Peterson-esque in terms of how that last year has gone, I think that's something that is going to have a big microscope on it, whether they bring Chandler Jones back or have a chance to bring him back, or if they have to go in a different direction.
Yes, he had 5 of his 10.5 sacks in game 1, right? But he led the Arizona Cardinals in pressures. He got a lot of attention that freed up other guys. Is that the number one question, Dani? Pass rusher.
I think so, because like Darren was saying, if you don't have Chandler Jones, that is a huge gap on your defense, and your other options would have to be looking throughout free agency when that officially hits, or in the draft. And typically, that's a lot to ask of a young rookie, a pass rusher, to be even nearly as disruptive as Chandler Jones is. That's a big ask. And so he is such a disruptive player on this defense that taking him out, I think, completely changes the dynamic of this Cardinals defense. And so without him, I think this defense looks a whole lot different, and that's going to take away from a lot of the other areas that they really do need to focus on as well.
You don't want to end up the Atlanta Falcons. They had 18 sacks as a team.
Look, if you don't have Chandler Jones, you're going to have to pay someone to be Chandler Jones. And you know what Chandler Jones can give you. 5 of his 6 seasons, he had double-digit sacks. He's only gotten better since his initial contract extension with the Cardinals after they acquired him. So that, to me, I'm paying Chandler Jones. It's not my money, but I can't see this team with pass rush without Chandler Jones on this team.
The issue, again, is going to be what his market is going to be. And part of the problem right now is that he's probably going to be, even at age 32, the number 1 pass rusher on the market. So somebody is probably going to be willing to pay him more money at this point than the Cardinals probably are. And I understand the argument that Craig has, that others have, that you don't want to lose Chandler Jones, but it's the balancing act of, okay, how much are we going to pay? You could tag him. You could have tagged him, but it would have cost you $25 million for next season, and I don't think they're comfortable with that. And if you give him a long-term deal, which somebody else might, that could cost you a pretty penny going far into the future. And again, when you start looking at the Steve Keim, we want to look 3 years down the road. It's kind of what happened with Calais Campbell, and I know that's a sore subject with some fans.
By the way, Calais is a free agent.
He is a free agent.
Go ahead.
But when he first left, I think the idea was he was still playing at a pretty decent level, but it was the back end of whatever long-term deal he was going to get that kind of frightened the Cardinals a little bit of, do we give him all this money and have dead money on the end? Now, it turned out Calais Campbell ended up playing well beyond that 4 years at a pretty high level, but that's the concern, especially after what you saw this year. Had a lot of pressures, wasn't quite getting to the quarterback after that first game on a regular basis. And again, it's the balancing that you have to make. This draft does have a decent amount of pass rushers. Are they Chandler Jones? We don't know, but I do think the Cardinals want to get younger.
And he's the highest ranked Cardinals free agent right now in most of the lists. The second highest ranked is Christian Kirk, right? So now you have receiver. And you don't right now have a legit number 2 receiver to go along with DeAndre Hopkins. You could maybe if you went on in the open market. Where does that rank in terms of need, Dani?
Right behind pass rusher for me when you're looking at this offense in terms of need, because you're right, you have DeAndre Hopkins, you have Rondale Moore, and then that's pretty much it, because Christian Kirk and A.J. Green are both going to be free agents. And I think this is a huge, huge hole for this team, because we learned when Hopkins was out that this team struggled not having that set number 2. There wasn't a lot of consistencies. Their numbers dropped. They started losing more games. That's not all on not having D-Hop out on the field, but it definitely played a role in that. And so I think you have to really look into the free agency market and see who is a true number 2. Who is somebody that if D-Hop is double covered, or if he gets hurt, or somebody else, you can really rely on them, somebody who's going to have good chemistry with Kyler Murray, because that was an area, that was a big drop-off when D-Hop was out. And so I think wide receiver is definitely up there. It's right below pass rusher for me.
This is the second straight offseason that we're talking about a number 2 wide receiver, a playmaker opposite DeAndre Hopkins. I thought that was going to be A.J. Green. If you just look at A.J. Green's number in totality, he was phenomenal for what he was paid this season. But it's how the season ended. His numbers were expected to go up. He's a former number 1, now number 2, elevated after Hopkins goes out. It didn't materialize. So now here we are again. What do you do opposite DeAndre Hopkins, or is it a combination? Do we see more of Rondale Moore? What about the tight end position, the running back position? How much does those positions come into play when you talk about taking some pressure or attention off of number 10 on the other side?
Yeah, running back and tight end right now, you have position coaches who are leaving the light on, right? I mean, those rooms are really empty right now, I mean, in terms of those 2 spots. But if you're going to go out and you're going to snag a proven wide receiver, to me, that is critical. Just because of the hit rate on first and second round receivers, if you're going to go that direction in the draft, you need a known, not an unknown at receiver right now, because it's DeAndre Hopkins, it's Rondale Moore, and TBD, to be determined. So whether you're going to go out and get possibly a Juju Smith-Schuster, who was a good number 2, wasn't a very good number 1. You know, I mean, there are other names you look at here on the list of other receivers. Russell Gage out of Atlanta, who came on, a young guy, sort of unknown at the very end. A Will Fuller, who used to be the running mate for DeAndre Hopkins back. I mean, there's a lot more availability potentially, Darren, on the free agent market with receiver than there would ever be with edge rusher.
No, and that's absolutely true. And I think adding a veteran wide receiver almost is begged for in this situation. I don't know if it's necessarily because of the hit rate as much as of numbers. You know, Rondale Moore is going to be a key player for you, but if Christian Kirk doesn't return, and again, there's another thing about what his market is going to look like, and it doesn't seem like A.J. Green at his age might be somebody they bring back. I think they do need another veteran, just because they're going to need somebody besides one that they might draft. I wouldn't rule out a receiver at 23, probably not, with some of the other needs that they're going to have. Want to improve at cornerback. We obviously talked about edge rusher, maybe interior offensive line. So, you know, I don't know if that comes right away, but what you get in free agency is going to be a very interesting, like, can you get a guy who is a very good number 2 outside player? You can't be going after a slot guy. Can you get a guy who's a little bit bigger, has some speed, and could serve as a number 1 if DeAndre Hopkins gets hurt? I mean, that's a big ask.
How about DJ Shark out of Jacksonville, 6'4" receiver? He might be gone, maybe. We'll see. I mean, you know, Christian Kirk is out there with photos double dating with Josh Allen, so I don't know if he's going to Buffalo or what's going on, Gree, but you keep coming back to running back and tight end.
When you look at the tight end position, as far as who's on the roster that you know you're going to have, 4 names. Only 1 actually played in a Cardinals uniform last season. That was David Wells.
I don't think I can name any of them.
Exactly. I think tight end, if you're going to ask me which position is more important within this offense that Cliff Kingsbury wants to run, you need to find a tight end. Now, it'd be great if you can get Zach Ertz and Max Williams back, but if you had to pick one or the other, I'm leaning more towards Max Williams. He's a little younger, not by much, but he's a better blocker. And I think you need more help on that line of scrimmage as far as what this offense potentially can be.
I don't disagree with that scouting report, but Dani, we all saw James Conner last year in a Pro Bowl season. He was the beating heart of the Cardinals offense. He wasn't just a playmaker, he was a mentality, that bully ball. I mean, what kind of importance and value do you attach to James Conner?
The player who led the team in touchdowns, I give him a lot of value. You're right, it wasn't just the physical aspects he brought on the field, but that mental aspect James Conner had as well, proving he could still be a number 1 running back. Yes, he did deal with a few injuries. That's pretty much going to happen to any running back with the amount of times you get beat up in a regular season. I don't know what this offense will look like without him. the way that he carried this offense, especially in Chase Edmonds' absence with his own injury. I think that James Edmonds fit really well in this offense, and I think that he garnered a lot of respect and had that leadership role in the locker room, which is important as well. It's just a matter of how much money is he going to want and what are the Cardinals going to be willing to pay for a running back, especially with this past year, he was that duo with Chase Edmonds. How likely is it that both of those free agents are going to be back in Cardinals uniforms? Then you're looking, okay, can one of these two players truly be a number one as opposed to sharing the reps like they were last year?
To me, running back is that's a third rail kind of position, and we all know why. And anybody who's followed this franchise knows why. I mean, David Johnson got the huge deal after his one big year a few years ago. That backfired pretty badly. And even Kenyon Drake, who got a lot of money for the 1 year, that didn't work out all that well either. And I think the Cardinals are going to approach it that way. And I think there isn't anybody that has worked alongside this team or worked in that locker room or even watched this team that doesn't want James Conner to be a Cardinal again next year. But I absolutely think that there is going to be a certain price that the Cardinals think he's worth for what they want to do, and they're probably not going to go above it. And maybe that means he's here, and maybe it doesn't. Same goes on a lesser extent with Chase Edmonds. I think they'd love to have Chase Edmonds back. He does everything right in terms of being in the locker room and being a leader and the things you want on the field, but what kind of money is he going to get? And you can fill those spots. I agree with Craig. The tight end thing is a concern. And while I think they would love to have both those tight ends back, and I think both those tight ends would love to stay here, I do wonder about the money. I'm wondering about all the money for all these guys. I mean, really, this is going to be a fascinating free agent process because we've jumped from the salary cap limitations from COVID, and now it's going to be kind of wide open, and it feels like there's going to be a lot more options for a lot more guys, even if the overall free agent class isn't quite maybe what has been in the last couple of years. I think there's going to be some money that can flow, and what does that mean for Christian Kirk or Zach Ertz or Chandler Jones or whomever?
I will say, going off the running backs, it reminds me of the conversation we were having about Chandler Jones and pass rush. If you're not going to play Chandler Jones, you know what he brings, you're going to have to pay somebody else to be Chandler Jones. And that's what I think of when we're talking about running backs. You're going to have to pay someone who's going to be a James Conner or a Chase Edmonds. So why would you not really work hard to bring one of those players back? You have Eno Benjamin, but he doesn't have that experience. So I know that you're having to give money to a position that typically gets beat up often throughout the year, but then you're just going to have to find somebody else to carry that workload and pay that.
But they did that last year, and they paid James Conner, $2 million, and look what they got. Now, you're not always going to hit like that, but that's the problem the James Conners and the Chase Edmondses of the world have right now, is because teams point to that and say, we just got that production for that amount of money. We'll go find somebody else.
Yeah, there was no better free agent deal in the NFL than James Conner. Less than $2 million, 18 total touchdowns. He's still in his prime. He's only 27, so we'll see what they decide on that.
By the way, Paul, as the best position that needs to be addressed in free agency, your affinity for special teams. And you got to make sure that Jeff Rodgers and his group gets acknowledged. This team needs a punter and a long snapper.
We all saw what happened when Aaron Brewer was out. A long-time long snapper. So you're right. You're absolutely right. So you're saying you might put that ahead of cornerback? Because that's where I was going next, Cree, was cornerback. Now, a lot of the mock drafts have the Cardinals going corner at number 23. Could be, okay. But once again, if you want to make sure Byron Murphy, for example, is that number 2 corner that you can move all over the place, like Cliff Kingsbury hinted at the Combine, then is there a number 1 corner out there? Oh, I don't know. Maybe you go into the last place Seahawks backyard and you steal DJ Reed, potentially a 25-year-old corner.
If you can find a good number 1 or number 2, so you can move Byron Murphy into the slot, I'm all for it. But if Byron Murphy's your number 1 and you're coming back with Marco Wilson, yeah, you have to address it in the draft. And say what you want, we only got 1 season out of him over 3 years, but I like what Robert Alford was able to do with this team. He plays very physical, and when he got hurt at the end of the season, that's when that back end in the secondary, there were several 20-plus pass completions, 20-plus yard touchdown completions against that defense. Now, it also goes back to what your pass rush is. But I'm a fan of Robert Alford. If you can bring him back, maybe not as a number 1 or a number 2, but for some depth, because you're going to need more than just 2 or 3 corners for an entire 17-game regular season.
Darren, do you expect a splash move? 2 years ago was DeAndre Hopkins in the trade. Last year was J.J. Watt out of left field. Do you expect a splash move come the start of the league year?
That's a great question. I didn't expect either of those two, so I'm gonna say it certainly could happen, even though I don't know if it's gonna happen. They're in a different cap situation than they have been. We all know that you can create cap space, and they will create cap space to have a little bit of elbow room, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult, I think, with some of the moves that they're going to make in free agency this offseason compared to last offseason, and I think that might hinder something like that, but I'm not going to put anything past Steve Keim. With the moves you've talked about, you never know.
And of course, the O-linemen are like, wait a minute, you didn't even mention the O-line, right, Danny? So we've heard the chatter about maybe a veteran guard. And we saw there were issues, obviously. And you got the Rams and Aaron Donald in your division. Do you go for that veteran right guard, perhaps?
This is so hard because when I'm thinking about all the different position groups, I'm like, oh yeah, of course you'd want a veteran, right? But you know, we've talked about needing a veteran for pass rusher and probably a veteran number 2 wide receiver. I think when you look at an offensive line, ideally though, you want to be able to develop these players. So does a veteran in free agency make sense? Or does it make more sense to look at filling those needs in the draft and working with younger players to really develop them into what you want? And we know that this offensive line has handled adversity before. It took until week 16 this past season to have all 5 starters start a game with Kyler Murray because of COVID and injuries and all of that. So that also makes me kind of wonder, well, maybe this coaching staff didn't feel like they got a fair look at all of these offensive linemen they had this year because they didn't all get a chance to really play together, play a full season. So I'm not sure that's the top of my list for free agency. That to me would make more sense looking at a draft prospect and developing an interior offensive line in that way.
I just want to congratulate all 3 of you for coming up with the 8 free agents they're going to need to sign and adding $100 million to the salary cap.
Yeah.
We work hard, Darren.
Yeah, I understand.
There's only a couple rules. Number 1, no math, so we didn't calculate. And then number 2, all opinions are your own. Own your opinion. That's the way it works here every year on the Free Agent Primer.